Some of you may wonder how I choose which comics to look at. And some of you may not care. For me, I follow two approaches. The first is a well thought out plan involving a look at specific titles and runs. And then there are times I just look at the box next to my chair and just reach in to grab whatever is at hand. If I find it amuses me, then I shall peruse said periodical. In this case, I decided to take a look at a comic from the early 80s, Avengers 223. If the cover sparks a memory, please allow me to refresh it for you.
Buckled in?
Yeah. No, I'm good. I'm good, Arrow Guy. Let's go. Let's go!
Before we dive in, let's take a look at the back. And man, oh man, it's Megaforce. This movie was so gloriously, deliciously cheesy. I loved it so much I did a multi-part recap of it on the Agony booth. In fact, I'm going to include a link to that down below in the video description. Our story is brought to us by David Michelini and Greg LaRocque. This issue is a few after the infamous Hank Pym smacking Janet Van Dyne / The Wasp incident that writers and editors simply can't get past, and a few issues before Roger Stern would begin one of the comic's most legendary runs. If that sounds like I'm dismissing this issue as being irrelevant or something, believe me, I don't feel that way at all. Our story opens up with the man at a carnival. It's Clint Barton, also known as Hawkeye. This is the Carson Carnival of Traveling Wonders, where Clint had first worked and mastered his craft as a bowman under the tutelage of the swordsman. Just to lay down some knowledge on you. Clint's come back home because he's received a note from the new owner, the daughter of the former boss, Old Man Carson, his tomboy daughter Marcella. Despite the fact that she's literally written a cry for help on the flyer, Clint thinks it's a joke, but he shows up anyway because apparently he wants to indulge in some hero worship from some girl. Man, Clint must really be hard up for simple human affection if he jumps at a chance like this. He attempts to enter the owner's trailer, but to use the local parlance, the carnies mistake Clint as a rube and give him the boot. Clint is about to kick some ass. Obviously his Lee jeans are filling him with confidence, but before he can wade in, one of the men pull out what looks like a ray gun. Because in comics only the Punisher uses real guns apparently. Clint backs down and decides his Lee jeans just aren't doing the job, so he decides it's time to Hawkeye up. Elsewhere at the carnival, we have Scott Ant-Man Lang on hand with his daughter Cassie, who wants to ride the spin and heave. I have no idea what that is, but I want to ride it. Scott accidentally drops a marble, which turns out to be his Ant-Man helmet. Turns out he's been experimenting with shrinking his costume to be able to carry it on hand, which isn't a bad idea. You'd think he'd carry it in a pouch or something, though. I recommend Crown Royale pouches, which come with a complimentary bottle of whiskey. Anyway, Scott spots Hawkeye running, and while he's not even an official Avenger, he's a hero and decides Clint might need some backup. Problem is, what to do with Cassie, who doesn't know her dad's Ant-Man. It's time for the spin and heave! Scott pays the guy running the roller coaster to let Cassie ride until the cash runs out, because bad parenting is funny! Personally, I wouldn't trust my daughter with this guy. He looks like he'd sell her to Jake Blues.
How much for the little girl? The women. How much for the women?
What?
Your women. I want to buy your women, the little girl, your daughters. Sell them to me. Sell me your children. Maitre d'.
Meanwhile, Hawkeye reaches the boss's trailer and finds it empty. But it doesn't take him long to spot the goons who kicked his ass earlier, escorting a redhead, namely Marcy. Hawkeye gets some sweet payback and dashes off with her to a nearby tent to hide out, and he realizes the tomboy has grown up into a beautiful woman, drawn in a way that Marvel artists are unwilling or more likely unable to these days. Marcy explains that the circus was taken over by some mysterious figure, but before she could say more, the lights go on. Elsewhere, Scott pulls the parts of his costume out of his pockets, and he realizes that maybe he didn't think this whole shrinking the costume down idea through, and I wonder if this is all some playful jab at how the Flash keeps his outfit in a ring. Silliness aside, I like the idea of there being drawbacks to having a secret identity. Not everyone has a walking stick you could smack on the ground and instantly change it to costume. His outfit finally full size, Scott suits up and sets about finding Hawkeye by contacting ants to be on the lookout for the bowman. Meanwhile, Hawkeye discovers who's taken over the carnival. Taskmaster. I had no idea who Taskmaster was before this comic, and right away I fell in love with this character. First of all, Look at that costume. Okay, sure, it's not exactly functional, but it's striking. And I appreciate what you have in the way of artistic discipline. If Todd McFarlane had done the art, he would have wasted an entire page on the Taskmaster's reveal. But here the Rogue realizes that he has to tell an entire story in one issue, so he had to carefully manage the space. Over the page, we get a little bit of useful exposition as Clint calls Taskmaster a goon peddler. Turns out Taskmaster's line is training henchmen for supervillains, and right away I'm loving this concept. Where do all these faceless minions come from? Why, from one of Taskmaster's schools. These days the man is a gun for hire, but honestly I love this iteration of the character so much more. Taskmaster explains that, yeah, he's got secret schools all over, but he's now branching out with a mobile recruiting operation with the Carnival as a cover. Again, this is an awesome idea. We've got an enterprising supervillain who sees an untapped market and is exploiting it. We learn all of this in one page, and sure, the exposition is pretty much supervillain monologuing, but Michelini handles it well. Hawkeye's had enough and takes a shot, but he discovers just how utterly badass Taskmaster really is. TM has photographic reflexes, which allows him to observe the actions of others and replicate them, so he's potentially the world's greatest martial artist and athlete. Add to that his watching film footage of the likes of Captain America, Spider-Man, Tigra, and Iron Fist, and he's utterly lethal. It's a fantastic concept, but the only problem I'm having is the likes of Tigra and Spider-Man are inhumanly agile, so I'm not sure if Taskmaster could physically replicate some of their moves. But it's a little nit. Taskmaster punks out Hawkeye, and when he's done making Clint look like a chump, he holds a gun to Marcy's head and the bowman surrenders. Meanwhile, Ant-Man is mistaken for a clown, and I wonder if maybe Michelini is poking fun at what, by the 80s, is a pretty outdated costume. But this is the company that still has artists drawing wings on Captain America's temples, so I really can't say I'm surprised. Scott gets word from the ant where Hawkeye is, and he quickly hitches a ride on a winged ant. Meanwhile, Taskmaster has gone all James Bond villain and has placed Hawkeye in a death trap, an electrified cage where he's going to get all biblical as a lion is going to eat him. I imagine at this point Clint is wishing he was still using the Pym particles to be Giant Man, because without his bow and trick arrows he's pretty much lunch. But before Hawkeye gets gnawed to death, Scott makes a truly cinematic save as he lifts the lion and tosses him into the electrified cage, knocking him out. A little later, after Clint's regained some of his dignity, he thanks Ant-Man for the save. And it's a nice touch here that it implies that Clint doesn't know Scott's secret identity because he calls him by his superheroic name. We find out that Ant-Man has taken on Taskmaster twice before in both the pages of Avengers and Marvel Team-Up. So yeah, when Scott told Taskmaster years later they were arch nemesis, yeah, he's making a pretty valid argument. When your first 3 outings as a villain wind up being against the same guy, that guy's your arch nemesis. Scott has a master plan for getting them out of the cage, and that involves shrinking them both down, and I like how Clint freaks out a little bit. It humanizes him. It makes him feel more real as he looks around at the world from the perspective of an insect. We find Taskmaster chewing out Marcy, and I like what LaRoque's done with her body language. We don't see her face, but her clenched fist at her sides implies tension and fear. It's little things like that which are important. But before Taskmaster can act on his threats, the heroes make a triumphant entrance. Scott lays down some Taskmaster knowledge on Hawkeye, and the bowmen blast the magnesium flare the villain used on the Avengers. Taskmaster sicks his minions on the heroes, but things go pretty badly for them, as even Marcy gets some of her own back. And I have to admit, I wish the comic was just a couple pages longer, as the entire fight is condensed into just 2 panels. The bad guys go down hard while Taskmaster takes a powder. The heroes catch up with the villain, but he reveals his backup plan, a bomb and a dummy being loaded into the human cannonball cannon. While Hawkeye wants to go after Taskmaster, Lang points out they can't risk the lives of the people in the stands. And if you're wondering whether or not this characterization seems strange, this is pretty consistent. This is not the leader and mentor readers are used to seeing in modern comics. Back then, Clint Barton was hot-headed and impulsive. It wasn't until he had become leader of the West Coast Avengers years later that we saw a more mature hero. Hawkeye takes a shot at the thug, but the man lands wrong and the cannon elevates and fires. But Scott has a plan B, and Hawkeye knocks his fastest arrow. It's then that we see the comic cover was not hyperbole, it was foreshadowing. Hawkeye shoots Scott at the explosive dummy as it reaches the apex of its climb, and the diminutive hero proceeds to crawl to the bomb. And when I first read this, I thought it was awesome, but wouldn't it have been easier if Clint had just used an explosive arrow on the dummy? I mean, what if Scott couldn't defuse the bomb in time? And if Scott could shrink Clint earlier, Wouldn't it have just been smarter to shrink the dummy so the explosion wouldn't have been any bigger than a firecracker? Anyway, the dummy hits the ground and doesn't go boom, and Hawkeye is afraid he's accidentally killed Ant-Man, who shows up and explains that after seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark enough time, he's become an expert at jumping from one fast-moving object to another. Taskmaster gets away, and the minions get wrapped up by the Avengers, and, hey, why is She-Hulk dressed in a torn slip? Come on, LaRoque. Jen's wearing costumes by this point. Do your homework. The story ends with Hawkeye presumably making time with Marcy, because, hey, to the victors belong the spoils, am I right? Meanwhile, Scott lucks out and finds his clothes were where he left them. And then he remembers he has a daughter. The story ends with him finding Cassie waiting for him on a bench outside the Spin and Heave rather than being the victim of an abduction. Overall, Avengers 223 is a fun one-off adventure with good art and an entertaining story. I admit I do have a couple issues with the issue. The fight against Taskmaster's goons could have used a few more panels, and I came up with 2 more sensible ways for the heroes to take out the bomb. But honestly, overall, it was worth the 60 cents I paid for it. I close out the review with a look at the bullpen bulletins, and considering whom we lost last week, it's bittersweet and maybe even a little ironic as I read Stan Lee talking about the passing of John Belushi. It turned out John was a fan of Marvel Comics, and after the Marvel Team-Up issue guest starring the Saturday Night Live cast had come out, he had begged Stan to come down to the bullpen to meet the gang. Stan then follows up with his talking about all the conventions he had recently attended, and it makes me sad. There will be no more convention appearances. There will be no more cameos in movies. Stan is gone, and I can't think of anything else to say other than I hope you enjoyed the video. So, I'll see you next time.